course not. It's
I was
empty.
going to use that for double duty.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Can you do like a wavy days in the audience? Yeah. I should have bought. I should have bought some. We have these buttons for the things. Say random control down.
we are going to ask our participants to start taking their seats. There's still a couple of folks filing in, so just as you guys already know, cell phones silenced. The representative needs to check his. All right, everyone, welcome to the 2019 Ruth Anderson Public Debate. Can I get a round of applause for folks being here to talk rent control on a Tuesday? Good. Says a lot that you want to spend your Tuesday night having important policy discussions, so I applaud all of you for being here as well. The mission of the Ruth Anderson Public Debate Series is to bring together experts, debaters, and community members to discuss issues of public concern. As I think you're aware, much like the rest of the region, Tacoma's rapidly growing housing market has left a lot of people concerned about the rising cost of housing, rent, as wages fail to rise in step. So tonight, our teams are going to debate whether a policy of rent control is the appropriate way to deal with this challenge that we face. So first, we want to make sure that we thank the people who made tonight possible, some of whom are in the room. I might make you stand. I haven't decided yet. So Pacific Lutheran University's School of Arts and Communication, the TOH Carl Forensics Forum, the Ruth Anderson Public Debate Organizing Committee, the Associated Students of PLU, as well as Ruth Anderson and Catherine Hedrick for making this event possible. A huge round of applause, please, everyone. All right, I'm going to introduce to you our debaters. We're going to start with Dina Braccio of the Tacoma Tenants Union. This is an appropriate time for applause, that's fine. Braccio is tenant educator and advocate for the Tenants Union. She became involved with the Tenants Union after consulting with them on her own landlord-related issue. Sitting next to her is Summer Ash. She is a senior. She's a senior at PLU, majoring in fiction writing with minors in literature and communication. She has 6 years of competitive debate experience and is also the captain of PLU's debate team. So Dina and Summer are going to be arguing tonight in favor of rent control. Speaking against rent control tonight will be Representative Andrew Barkis. He is a Republican who represents Washington's 2nd District. He's responsible for crafting the majority of Washington's affordable housing policy. He owns a property management company, and he is in his 2nd term as a Washington State representative. Next to him is Hannah Backus. You guys are so lively. I love it. Hannah is a junior at PLU, majoring in biology with a pre-medicine emphasis. She has 4 years of competitive debate experience and is also the president of the PLU College Republicans chapter. So thank you to all of our participants. All right, I want to talk quickly about the debate structure this evening. So first, in the first round, each of the 4 debaters on stage are going to give a 7-minute opening statement. They're going to make their best case to you. In the second round, they are all going to field questions that I pose to them. They have not seen these questions ahead of time. In the final round, debaters are going to give a 3-minute closing statement to wrap up their thoughts. We are going to use, for those who aren't familiar with it, the Woodward shift of opinion ballot to decide the debate. That means at the start, we're going to ask your opinion on the question at hand. At the conclusion, we're going to ask your opinion for a second time. The side that shows the greatest change of opinion is going to win. So we're going to start by voting now. Again, the resolution before us is Tacoma should institute a policy of rent control. So I want you to get out your cell phones, and you're going to text the number 37607. This is going to be on the screen. We're going to give you a couple minutes to cast your vote. Again, the number you're texting, 37607. And then for the content of the message, if you believe there should be rent control in Tacoma, you're going to text 704-651. 704-651. If you are against rent control in Tacoma, you're going to text the message 704-655. Again, 704-655. And if you are unsure, boy, did you come to the right place tonight. You might be able to make up your mind by the end of the evening. You're going to text 704-656. 704-656 if you are unsure about whether there should be rent control. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to get those votes in, and then we'll begin. Still see some folks getting their votes in, so I'm going to wait just a little bit longer. Oh yeah, we just had some people walk in. So for folks who just walked in, if you wish to cast a vote before we begin, which is an important part of the evening, you can see directions on the screen behind me. Is anybody still voting? Okay, we're going to give you a little bit. I think just one. Just one. I will know. Now I have my eye on you. She's got 3 cell phones over there. It does feel like America's Got Talent. Yes. Okay, are we ready to begin? For our opening arguments, we are going to hear first from the side in favor of rent control, Summer Ash.
Housing is a human right, and it's one that our city, state, and nation have not been doing enough to protect. I saw an article the other day titled, "Lack of Affordable Housing Remains the Leading Cause of Homelessness." It's absurd to me that such an obvious statement can be headline news in 2019. But I think where this comes from is that many people just refuse to accept that there are actual practical measures we can be taking to alleviate our homelessness crisis. Understanding the scope of this crisis is difficult, and that's partly because it's really difficult to get accurate statistics on homelessness.
Mic up.
Census data is typically collected house by house, and if you're homeless, you're likely not to be as easy to locate. This is why a one-night count is sometimes performed to try to get an accurate picture of how many people are experiencing homelessness on any one given night. According to the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, in one night in 2018, 552,830 people in America were experiencing homelessness. Note, too, that this is likely a very drastically underestimated number. Of that 500,000 people, 33% are families with children. This debate is not only about homelessness, though. The term housing insecure includes people experiencing homelessness, but also includes those who have to live in constant peril of not knowing if their housing situation will be stable in the coming future. I argue that as long as landlords have the power to raise rent by as much as they choose at any given time with very little warning, that makes nearly anyone renting in Tacoma housing insecure. In this speech, I am going to address how rent hikes have negatively affected us here in Tacoma, and then explain how we can mitigate housing insecurity by implementing a policy of rent stabilization. With rent skyrocketing in so many cities all across the nation, many people are overburdened by these costs and end up forcibly displaced or in debt as a result. Here in Tacoma, the 98402 zip code, including much of the downtown area, frequently makes top 10 or 20 lists for zip codes with the highest rent increases or the most rapid gentrification. This has already gone too far. Tech bros are flooding in from Seattle and California, and with no more waterfront real estate to develop, investors are pushing development up the hill, usurping Hilltop, a historically black neighborhood, and forcing out families who have lived in Tacoma for generations. From 2010 to 2015, 35% of Hilltop's black residents moved out of the area, and with them, many businesses which had stood in the area for decades were lost too. The current direction of the city is one which is leaving many people unable to afford to live in the city they grew up in, or that their family has lived in for generations. 45% of Hilltop's residents are cost burdened, which means they spend at least 30% of their income on rent. This prevents these people from being able to afford other things they need, but often they have no other choice but to keep paying these unsustainable costs. We aren't afraid of growth and development, but we have to recognize that this new development is not being conducted in a way that is uplifting all of Tacoma's residents. The light rail is going to come right down MLK, and that kind of public transportation infrastructure has been long needed to grant people increased mobility and to access job opportunities. But the people who need this public transportation the most are being priced out of the downtown area and into unincorporated areas which often desperately lack for resources like transportation. This leaves these people with no way to access the light rail or any of the new businesses which have been transplanted where they once lived. Resources like this can only benefit us if people are able to stay around to use them. This is, of course, a multifaceted issue, and this debate is only focused on one part of how homelessness or housing insecurity occurs. But we believe strongly that pessimism and complacency are not acceptable answers to why many people are systemically barred from basic necessities like shelter, food, and education because of a lack of affordable housing. Our proposed solution is called rent stabilization, which is different from rent control, as it is not just a simple cap on how much landlords can charge for rent. Instead, it is a restriction on rates of increase, which can fluctuate with factors such as inflation or local development. Such a system relies on lawmakers who determine a set rate which landlords can increase rent in the coming year or another determined period. For example, they might determine that landlords can only increase rent by as much as 2% in the next year. In areas like Tacoma, where yearly median rent increases can be as steep as 8 to 10%, this would represent a significantly lower payment for renters and would keep many people from encountering the huge shock of their rent suddenly costing hundreds of dollars more than the previous year. We already recognize the importance of laws which hold landlords accountable to safety codes or that keep them from being able to evict tenants for no reason. These laws minimize the ability of landlords to exploit their tenants. Rent stabilization is the logical next step in ensuring protection for renters and in minimizing the housing insecurity, which comes from not knowing if next month's rent is going to be too high for you to pay or is going to cut into your already limited grocery funds. Some people view rent stabilization as an overstepping on landlords, who might be financially burdened themselves. Landlords, however, are protected as much as they need to be by this plan. While a simple cap on rent might disadvantage them, a restriction to 1 or 2% increases year to year allows them to adjust for things like inflation. What we are correcting for is exploitation, where landlords who function as and often are corporations are raising rent merely for profit seeking, even when this devastates the lives of their renters, and even when they are unable to do so only because tenants often have no other choices for housing. Nationally and locally, we are experiencing a crisis of homelessness and housing insecurity. Pessimism and complacency are not doing anything to alleviate this stress, which affects so many in our communities. Rent stabilization is an important first step in protecting our right to housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Summer. We are going to hear now from Representative Andrew Barkis in opposition to rent control. With your opening statement, sir.
Thank you, Brandy. Well, good evening. I'm Representative Andrew Barkis, and I've had the honor and privilege of representing the 2nd Legislative District. I've served in the legislature for the last 3.5 years, and I've been in property management business for over 30 years. I own a property management firm in Thurston County, and we currently manage over 1,200 single-family homes. All this experience has put me at the forefront of legislative policy work around housing. I'm happy to be here tonight to discuss issues facing housing in our state and to share with you solutions that will help solve the problems we face, as opposed to new policies such as rent stabilization, rent control, that will only make the problem worse. My experience and willingness to work with all parties has been evident in the good policy work accomplished in the last few years as my time in the legislature. The squatters bill, source of income, increased notification for termination due to building changes, etc. I worked last year to bring forth common sense reform to the landlord-tenant law, introducing 4 pieces of legislation around eviction reform. Unfortunately, common sense did not prevail, and instead some of the most extreme legislation regarding the landlord-tenant law was passed. The success of passing this legislation by those advocating on behalf of tenants has emboldened them to move forward with action to bring rent control to our communities and ultimately to the state of Washington. So what is rent stabilization, or what is more commonly referred to as rent control? Rent control limits how much landlords can charge in rent. Typically, a board sets the rental rates in an area, or a blanket policy establishes a rental cap. The rental amount cannot exceed this cap. There are various forms of rent control, but the most common use now is referred to as rent stabilization and uses a rent cap amount. Oregon's new legislation set this cap at 7%. Rent stabilization is a blanket solution to try to curb the housing affordability issue facing our communities and our state. And as we've seen with other rental-related policies, a blanket solution that involves more regulations on the industry does not always work, because what's good for one area may not be working somewhere else. This approach to housing affordability crisis creates paths for over-regulation and does not solve the problems surrounding the lack of availability or the costs associated with housing. So why is it that whenever we get into difficult housing markets that we always hear the same cry for rent control? It's because of the unwillingness to look at other options to help the private sector develop. And property owners are the target of these policies when they should be the ones that are helped. Over the last several years, we've seen an increase in the demand for housing. A booming economy, massive population growth, primarily being driven by Washington's tech economy. This has put a lot of pressure on the housing market, and as a result, prices have gone up. I'm going to talk to you about what we should have been doing to alleviate this pressure over the last several years in a moment. But first, we need to talk more about the proposed solution to the problem. It really is not a solution, it's more of a reaction. It's poorly planned policy that has more downside than up. We have seen all over the country where it has been implemented, and I have to say, fortunately, there are not a lot of jurisdictions that have this policy. And that should tell you something. If it was a solution to the problem, then why has it not been implemented all over the country? Why is it only one state, Oregon, the last year to become the first state to do it actually statewide? It does not surprise me that California would be next, or Washington that wants to follow suit. Has the housing rental problem been solved in San Francisco? They've had some version of rent control for many, many years. No, it's actually worse than ever. Did it solve it in New York? No, it's still extremely expensive. And in Massachusetts, it didn't solve it so bad that they actually repealed the laws that were in place there. Rent stabilization keeps overall rents actually on the higher side by disincentivizing new construction. And this creates scarcity as developers have less incentive to build new housing if there is a ceiling or cap placed on what they can ultimately charge. With limited ability to earn profit on their investment, developers are incentivized to take their dollars to other non-rent controlled communities. And here's a perfect example of this. Statistics show that following the new Oregon law capping the rent there, that multifamily investments, particularly from out-of-state buyers, significantly declined almost 38%. In Vancouver, Washington, just across the border from Portland, Oregon, due to the impacts of the Oregon's rent control laws, they're actually experiencing just the opposite, exceptionally strong multifamily investment. We can't gamble with these investors bringing business and tax revenue into our state by imposing the same kind of rental capping regulations. How about the impacts of rent stabilization to our communities and state's economy? Rent stabilization costs local governments critical revenue, as the assessed value of rent-controlled properties decline, and with it, the property taxes they generate. And we have to remember these taxes pay for our schools and roads and so much more. Multifamily housing and land development creates tax revenue, B&O taxes, real estate excise tax, sales taxes, and many more. Housing development, rehabilitation, and maintenance generate significant economic benefit in terms of job creation, wages, and overall economic output. Rent stabilization eliminates most of these benefits as rental housing activity is reduced or eliminated. Rent stabilization also disincentivizes property owners from maintaining their properties. This lack of investment leads to deterioration, which eventually leads to loss of critical needed rental housing supply. So as we continue to see, there's a lot of downside to this proposed solution, and we must take all these points into consideration. And my main purpose of being here tonight is to talk to you and engage in this discussion and bring my alternative solutions to the table to show that we can have an impact on the housing affordability crisis if we look past this one-pronged approach, rent stabilization or control, and move towards a holistic solution that includes addressing the real problem of lack of supply. Here's how we address this with real common sense solutions and legislative action. 1, let's expedite the permitting process at all levels, getting units to the market so much faster. 2, increase zoning and density flexibility. Think accessory dwelling units. Tax incentives and exemptions. Think the multifamily housing tax exemption that we could be using. Sales tax. Develop a credit to help those who are building lower that burden. And also mitigate the fees. Many fees, permits, impacts, hookups, stormwater. All these fees impact cost. These solutions will get at the cost of developing housing and allow for more affordable housing units being built, along with more market rate units. Reducing the cost of development 20 to 25% allows for units to be priced more affordably. It really is a simple calculation, but the policies surrounding this are very difficult and will demand bold decisions by policymakers. I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak to you here tonight, and I look forward to this friendly debate and the continued discussion on how we can make a positive and lasting impact on our local communities and state in this affordable housing crisis time without putting into place more restrictive, burdensome regulations upon property owners. Thank you.
Representative, thank you. We are now going to go back to the side in favor of rent control and hear from Dina Braccio with the Tacoma Tenants Union. Your opening statement, please.
Hey, I think we all understand why we're having this debate on rent control, and I think the previous speakers have done a good job at explaining our present moment. But to use my own words, we are currently at the end of a decade-long period of economic expansion that has seen rent and housing prices soaring across the country. This has been coupled with overproduction of luxury units, causing many people to be pushed out of their neighborhoods or out of housing altogether. Whole communities are being displaced in order to make way for new construction that they could never afford. Nearly 40% of new construction nationwide is being targeted at the highest end of the market. What that looks like in Washington is a dramatic increase in rents, not just in Tacoma and Seattle, but also Spokane, Tri-Cities, and the rural portions of our state as well. And as those rents have gone up, people are at best forced to move out of the places they have called home, and at worst left with no place they can afford to call home. The status quo is broken, and doing nothing is not an option. This debate is about what policies we need to address the crisis. Before we get into why rent control is necessary and the best way to improve the lives of the millions of renters in Washington state, I want to take a minute to make some clarifications. When I talk about rent control, I mean a program that covers all renter households, strongly limits year-by-year rent increases, and continues to regulate those prices even when tenants move out and the home is re-rented. Altogether, this is a program called Universal Rent Control, and it is what we all should be fighting for. Now, I know that sounds like a lot, but I assure you, rent control is a fundamentally modest proposal. To start, let's consider the question: what is a landlord? A landlord almost never built the home. A landlord usually does not make repairs to the home, and in most cases, all a landlord has done is have enough money to buy outright more housing than they need for themselves in order to profit off of someone else's basic human need for shelter. A practical proposal would be to prevent a situation where one person can own more of a human necessity than they can use. Rent control is not this radical proposal. Rent control is merely the idea that there should be some limit to how much one person can profit off of another human's basic needs. This is especially important because there's no alternative to renting for the majority of working class people. In order to have access to a home, a place to be at rest, and live your life, you must either rent or have enough money at one time to be able to buy a home. The average home price in Tacoma right now is $315,000. Realistically, you would need to have between $15,000 and $30,000 in cash in order to be eligible for a mortgage. Compare that to the median amount an American household has in savings, just under $5,000. Beyond the financial constraints, racist housing policies have been and continue to be used to limit home ownership to predominantly white families at the exclusion of black and brown families. The fact is that owning a home is a privilege that many people don't have access to. Statewide, 1 in 3 households are renters. Cities have different breakdowns, but here in the Puget Sound area, roughly half of households are renters. All of us renters deserve to have stability in our lives, and our stability is more important than another person's ability to make more money. Sounds pretty moderate to me. Stability is actually one of the biggest outcomes of effective rent control policies. Across New York City, 23% of renters in rent-controlled apartments have lived in their apartment for over 20 years, compared with just 7% in market-rate housing. When Santa Monica passed rent control in the mid-'80s, the proportion of renters who had lived in their home for over 5 years doubled from 27% to 54%. This stability allows people to breathe. It allows people to plan their lives and invest in themselves and their communities. It allows children to grow up without changing schools every year, and it allows seniors to age in the communities they have known their whole lives. In addition to the stabilizing effect on individual renters, there are also related benefits for the housing sector as a whole. Construction of new units is actually higher when rent control is in effect. This can be seen in the Bay Area, where cities with rent control have higher construction rates than neighboring cities without rent control. Similarly, when Boston and its surrounding cities lost rent control in the mid-'90s, the constructions of new units decreased and the vacancy rate, the percentage of housing units available at any given time, fell from 4% to 2.9%. During this same period, rents more than doubled. On top of all that, rent control is also the cheapest and fastest way to stabilize the millions of Washington state renters currently living in market-rate housing. In New York City, twice as many low-income tenants live in rent-controlled apartments as lived in subsidized housing. And San Francisco has 3 times as many rent-controlled units as all other types of affordable housing. Building new subsidized units is important, but it will never meet all of our needs. Unlike creating new affordable housing, implementing rent control can be done practically overnight. This means we don't need to wait years before we see a benefit to renters who are already struggling all over the state. As an added bonus, you might be surprised to learn it's also cheaper to extend regulations to existing buildings than it is to construct entirely new buildings. Rent control is the best way to begin addressing our current housing crisis by better using what housing already exists to meet our collective needs. We can stop the wholesale displacement of communities and begin to address the longstanding disparities of our housing system. It can provide all renters the kind of price stability homeowners have long had access to, and with it, the peace of mind and better health that stability offers.
Thank you, Dina. For our final opening statement, we are going to hear from Hannah Backus, who's speaking against rent control. Hannah, go ahead.
Why does land ownership matter? If we are to understand this debate, we ought to examine the innate crux of this topic. This debate needs to be recentered to examine the effect to the rights of landowners, as rent control seeks to further restrict the liberty of those who own the property. However, in order to understand why the rights of these proud, hard-working individuals matter, we must return to the question, why does land ownership matter? If you are like me, you might be uncomfortable when first confronted with this question, simply because you never truly considered the reasoning behind why owning property is important, and merely accepted that it is. The reason for this is that we've been told since the early years of our education that owning your own land is a fundamental right. In fact, according to one of the greatest Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke, we are born with 3 unalienable rights: the right to life, liberty, and property. If we were to lack one, the others would invariably collapse. Without prioritizing the ability to live, there would be no option to use one's liberty, nor to protect what you have worked to be your own. Without the utilization of liberty, Is one truly living, or are they merely a disposable cog in a machine? Furthermore, as the right to property ownership was intended to provide the capacity to protect one's well-being and one's acquired prosperity, what would there be to live for and to aspire for should this be stripped from you? What identity could you claim to have if not for these three? It is for this reason why our founding fathers used this basic principle in our Declaration of Independence, when they proclaimed that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is not a coincidence that property is equated to the pursuit of happiness. The ability to own property, or moreover, propensity to have a say in what happens to your bodily autonomy, and the right to determine what happens to what you have desperately strived to be able to secure for yourself and for your family, is what the pursuit of happiness encompasses. It is for these reasons why these three rights and essential are what make up the fabric of the glorious American dream. And this, everyone, is the concept that individuals have relentlessly fought and died to protect for centuries. The belief that this is the nation where you are able to come and could have something to your name. The basic foundational idea that allows you to have freedoms that you cherish. All because of life, liberty, and the ability to own your own property. This is where rent control unknowingly seeks to undermine the basic principle of the American dream by trivializing the ownership of property. One side of this debate tries to paint the image that tenants need to be protected from a corrupt business tycoon whose goal is to purchase the largest amount of property while renting at the highest price without thoughts to the needs of others. What they fail to mention, however, is that the rental market is not entirely made up of these faceless corporational entities. In fact, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, 74.4% of landlords are people who are just trying to earn a little more income in order to provide for their families and for future generations. These are people who are proud of what they own, who labor endlessly to upkeep these properties, and who stake a part of their means on the ability for tenants to uphold their agreements. Human rights activist and renowned philanthropist Mikhail Khodorkovsky best describes the relationship between a person and their property when he states, "The right to private property meant at the same time the right and duty to be personally concerned about your own well-being, to be personally concerned about your family's income, to be personally concerned about your future. This is hard work." The harm of rent control is that we hand our right to our autonomy to the government, who is then empowered to make choices for us. Sacrificing our right to make choices for ourselves will lead to the betterment of the government rather than protecting the well-being of the people. Tenants will not be held accountable for their actions, as while rent control provides more protections to renters, it decreases the say that property owners have in determining who stays in their property and what boundaries are established contractually. Landowners will be plunged into irreversible debt through restoration covering unpaid bills, taxes, and more. As the debt accumulates and the lack of income increases as time goes on, landowners will not be able to keep their heads above water. Instead of being able to provide housing for others, these individuals who are only trying to be able to provide for their families will be put into a position where not only could they lose their rental property, but could also lose their own home as well. This is the true threat of rent control, creating conditions where current problems are only exacerbated. What happens should we lose these people as a result of rent control? The 74.4% of individuals will be taken over by the faceless corporations that we fear. This is because the amount of debt that landowners will be in will force them to sell the property in order to cover the cost or be forced to become tenants themselves. The result of business entities becoming primary rental owners is twofold. Firstly, less money is being spent by consumers into various aspects of the economy because the income generated by renters is tied up into the corporations themselves. This causes a direct hit to the economy, making prices increase in order to compensate for the lack of revenue, which will directly harm consumers. Second, costs will also increase in the rental sector as fees to upkeep properties will spike to the point where the remaining landowners will be driven out of the market as bigger corporations can more easily adjust to the change in price. We already know why we should fear these ruthless corporations. What you must comprehend is that while the majority of landowners are individuals, we must prioritize their protection. What are you going to do for those individuals who are using renting as a way to make ends meet? Are you going to choose to sacrifice them by taking away their rights as a property owner? Are you going to choose to make the other side of reality where business entities dominate the market? Or will you choose to provide equal rights to both landowners and tenants? Thus, why does the right to land ownership exist? Because it empowers individuals to have the liberty to create a life of their choosing. The best way to protect the American dream, not just for present-to-come residents, but for generations to come, is not with stripping our rights away. Instead of having the government choose, allow the market. Moreover, allow the people to have the right to choose. It is for this reason why we unconditionally should not adopt a rent control policy.
I want to thank both sides for their opening statements. You're now going to field questions from me. Debaters are going to have a minute and a half to answer the initial question. I may allow the other side a follow-up depending on the answer. And we'll take about 15 minutes for this portion of the debate. Dina Braccio, I want to start with you with this question, speaking in favor of rent control. You suggested in your opening that the majority of the time landlords will cut costs and seek to increase profits, no matter the impact this has on their renters. Is that statement based in fact, and if so, which facts, or are your personal feelings towards landlords involved?
I didn't make that statement.
It wasn't a quote, but a general. Or was that you, Summer? Oh, sorry, landlords are raising rent merely for profit seeking. Can you answer that question?
When you are raising rent by such significant portions as 8 to 10% each year, that is for profit seeking. They function as corporations. The other side admitted that they're intending, like, they function as corporations, right? They're trying to make personal profits. Our policy of a 1 to 2% cap, right? That's not stopping landlords from having a right to own property. That's just cutting out this exploitation through profit seeking.
Representative Barkas, I want to have you respond to that. You have been a landlord for many years, correct?
I have.
Can you respond to the accusation that some landlords are raising rent merely for profit seeking?
Well, Brandy, landlords are in the business of making money to support whatever it is they're doing, to be able to pay their mortgages, to pay their taxes, utilities, and do those different things.
And I want to clarify quickly. I think the insinuation is that they are trying to make profit beyond what is reasonable.
I can't speak for all landlords. I know in my case it's not an accurate statement whatsoever, and the majority of the landlords that I talk to in the business do not seek to the profit seeking, as they're saying, or as was stated by the other debater, that they put profit over basic human needs. That's a bold statement. And also saying that landlords, never have built a home and never have repaired their homes is also a bold statement. In the thousands of landlords who I've talked to over the 30 years I've been doing this, I would say quite the contrary. Now, I'm sure, as in any business, there are a percentage that will do that. There are a percentage of those that would be considered slumlords. There are those that would put profit over whatever. I mean, there's those type of people in any kind of business. It doesn't matter what that business is. But in the needs of housing and in the industry, that is the exception, not the rule. And when this comes into play, when we're developing a policy that is going to be blanket over all, we're making that the rule, not the exception. And so we're making a policy based on maybe some bad actors within the industry. But to say that it's all about just the profit, I would say that is not an accurate statement.
Dini, do you care to have a quick rebuttal to that?
Yeah, I mean, it is true that every landlord I've ever talked to does tell me that they rent at below market rate and have never evicted a tenant. But that being said, you on your property management site, you say that your business is there because that for your business, the landlord's property and their business are your number one priority. And that is just fundamentally at odds with tenants and people's well-being being the number one priority.
She brought up your website, so I think
Thank
you can
you.
respond.
Go for it.
I am contractually obligated under state law when we represent, by the agency of law, we represent our owners. That is a contractual obligation. We work with our tenants. We work for our owners. That is a model of property management. When somebody contracts with me to manage their house, I am their agent, therefore I am them, and have to take all those responsibility, fiduciary responsibility, upkeep of the house, taking care of the tenants and everything else. The tenants are guided by the landlord-tenant law, which the lease and everything else specifically references, and everything else that goes along with that relationship that's put forth on that. And I can also say, just from a personal standpoint, you can ask how many evictions we've done. I think we've done 2 this year, and there's usually a cause behind why that eviction happens. And as far as personally, the last property that I bought, the tenants have been in there for 10 years. They're still in that house, and the rent is $600 below market.
We're going to return to the moral argument over this in a second. Dina, I'm going to have a follow-up question for you. You made your case tonight for rent control in Tacoma, but as you know, it remains against the law statewide, despite the fact that we have pretty progressive leadership in Washington state. So if the ban on rent control hasn't been reversed to this point, what do you think it's going to take, politically speaking, for that to happen?
Politically speaking, it is going to take what making positive changes has always taken, and that is the people who are not being benefited by like the current domination of moneyed interests to get up and make their voices heard. There are 2 types of power in this world, and predominantly the type of power that has been winning out, throughout the broad sweep of human history has and continues to be money. And the other type of power is people power, and that's what it's always going to take, and that's what it's always took.
I'm going to move over to Hannah Backus for this question. You may have heard stories, tell me if you haven't, about price gouging water after a natural disaster. You heard those stories? Hurricane, flood. There's actually, I believe 13 states that have laws against doing that when there's a state of emergency that's been declared, because water, of course, is a necessity to life. So if we apply that same principle here, the opposition has argued that housing is a basic human right. How can you argue against the moral argument that they're making tonight?
I feel as though that in this debate, it's been mischaracterized that landowners aren't people as well. Why are they not entitled to the same basic rights that tenants are in being able to have the right to property, to be able to have the right to these basic human rights? We're not saying that tenants shouldn't have the right to housing. What we're saying is that we need to understand that landowners are also individuals who have rights that need to be protected in this debate, and that rental control is certainly not the best opportunity to be able to protect these rights.
Dina, you look like you have a response to that.
Yeah, I mean, no one's coming after the home that landlords live in, and like an equal set of rights would be stability in the home that you live in.
Let me ask you, Dina, as a follow-up. Do you have go ahead. You can do that.
Actually, in my speech, I clearly illustrated how actually, yes, they are coming for a landowner's home. If a tenant does not pay what they're established contractually to do, landowners are putting their means into this property, their means to survive, their means to pay their bills into this home. What happens if this isn't paid? There aren't if what happens if they miss a payment or something.
Dina, let me ask you, how much profit do you think is appropriate for a landlord to make on a home?
Wow. I mean, appropriate?
How much morally to you would be appropriate?
0.
Okay.
Representative Barkas, I'm going to allow you to respond to that. I'm going to allow you to respond to that. There's been a debate tonight about how much rental housing is in the hands of corporation versus how many is in the hands of maybe a retiree or someone who owns 1 or 2 rental properties. Your opponent has said that she believes 0 profit is appropriate. What do you say to that, sir?
Well, it does exist. They're called nonprofit organizations, and they do supply housing, and they do not have a profit. And there is a certain segment of the market that addresses. There is a lot of state public housing. We have a housing trust fund. There's a lot of different entities that do housing that doesn't have a profit. But when you are a landlord and you take the risk, you invest your money, you purchase a property, you put a tenant in there, you repair it, you pay the taxes, you do everything that has to be done, there is the ability to have a profit. That is how our country works. That is how this system is founded. That's what's made America the greatest country in the world, is because we have the ability to do that. And if we're going to start talking about just this particular thing, where do we stop? Is the person who owns the mini mart not allowed to make a profit on the Coke they sell, or the pack of gum they sell, or the gas station, or the restaurant, or anything? I mean, it goes on and on and on and on from there. So how can you say that people are not allowed to make a profit? It's just an unfathomable statement, I guess is the only way I can put it.
15 seconds. Go ahead.
Yeah. I agree. That is not currently the system we have. The question was, how much is it ethically to profit off of someone else's basic need for shelter? And so that's how I feel. You know, wow, so many questions. But
We'll get back to you.
yeah,
fine. Summer, I'm going to direct this question for you. So far, as we discussed, in this state, there's been a lack of political will to pass or overturn the current ban on rent control. Would time be better spent trying to stabilize home prices instead of trying to institute a policy of rent control, thus opening up home ownership, the American dream, to more people, and also resulting in a drop in rent?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. Mic up again, sorry. I'm not really sure what such a policy would look like. I don't really have a reason to believe that we couldn't do both things.
Is it possible? Does anybody care to rebut to that? Do you think that time is better spent on something politically that can be done, such as trying to get a drop in home prices?
We actually are working on that. There are so many different forms at the state, at the federal level. There's, again, I mentioned the Housing Trust Fund. There are so many programs within housing commerce for first-time home buyers, for minorities, for you name it. We literally are putting hundreds of millions of dollars into the housing program within the state of Washington to help those people who are able to buy and those people who are starting out buying. All the regulations that went into change after the housing market crash that changed the way things are done. I just came from a banking seminar that talked about banking and credit unions. It's amazing the amount of work that's being done to help people get into housing, both in purchasing housing and also through the Housing Trust Fund and the things that we've done for renting. So there is a lot of money being poured into this system.
Summer?
Yes, I agree that housing should be affordable and also renting should be affordable.
Those two things go hand in hand to a certain extent.
Yeah, I believe so.
Summer, I'm going to direct this question to you as well. Your opposition argues, and some opposition to rent control, I mean, this has been a well-debated topic, argues that increased control over landlords, rent control, would actually result in fewer rental properties being available or more of them falling into the corporate hands that you're so concerned about, thus ultimately hurting renters. How do you respond to that concern?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dina had statistics in their case as to why that's not true. Like right now, 98% of new development in Tacoma is targeted towards like the incoming tech bros, right? And are not actually multifamily housing. We think that this policy just opens up the ability for multifamily housing. We have no reason to believe that this is actually going to really devastate landlords, right? Restricting you from raising rent to only what is needed to be able to stay afloat amidst things like new development and inflation, we think is just reasonable and acceptable, right? We're not taking away their houses. We're saying that instead of raising rent by hundreds of dollars, maybe you just raise rent by 1% for the next year. This is not radical. This is just saying that the profit seeking cannot be as extreme as it is right now. We think that this is just an acceptable policy to be able to create more housing for like more affordable housing.
I'm going to pose this to either of you who would like to answer. There was an argument made by your opposition that too many of the units being built currently are luxury units. Tech Bros came up a couple times. Do you believe that too many rental units are being made in a luxury sense, or for tech bros, and not enough for people who can't afford such an apartment?
I don't believe that there's too many being built right now. In fact, I don't believe that there's enough just housing units being built right now, regardless of the capacity in which they're being built for. Again, if you have a doctor and there's a cap on, like, if you have a shortage of doctors and you put a cap on doctors, like, how does that actually solve the problem? You need more doctors to come in and, like, actually solve the problem. Why would that be any different for housing?
we're seeing in the marketplace is what the demand is, and the market is rising to what that demand is, and that what we're seeing in Seattle primarily. But we're also seeing the types of units being built and the cost of those is in direct correlation to the cost of developing that housing. And that's why I talk about that 25% aspect of lowering that cost. I toured a development in the University District. It's built at a modular, it's a company right here in Tacoma building modular units, building apartments, fully sustainable solar. It's amazing. And they're coming in at a lower cost. They're going to build the first all-affordable unit housing tower downtown Seattle in modular units. How? Because they found a way to lower the cost. But they're still coming to me saying, Representative, we need to do some policy to lower those costs, because every time we lower the cost, we can build a lower unit. So right now, the stuff that's being built there is one, it's the demand that's being put forth, Amazon, all the different things that are happening there. But there's also other units being built. But even those other units being built are expensive to build. And the rent that's being charged is a direct result for the cost per unit to build. The gentleman was asked at a panel I was at the other day, he said, can you build me a unit for $200,000? And he actually laughed. He told us that at $100,000 plus was the cost of all the things before he ever put a spade in the ground to turn in the dirt to actually start building the actual unit.
We're going to get a couple more questions in. Dina, this question is for you, something that your opposition brought up in their opening arguments, that if this was such a good idea, why don't more states do it? What would you say to that, we do have progressive states that still have not implemented such policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good ideas we haven't done. So, I think there's, a good idea where we make sure that healthcare is always, cheap and available to people. I haven't really seen that. There's, a thing where, we could, maybe make sure that no one ever, went hungry. That would be a cool thing that we haven't done. Man, I don't even know. We could, stop the over-policing of poor and black and brown communities. That would be a cool thing we haven't done. Because, but the reason we haven't done all these things is because there is profit in it. The current system is not, broken. The current system is working as is intended in order to continue to produce profits for people who benefit from the housing shortage, people who benefit from the insecurity that people have, in order to exploit them either at home or at work, in order to exploit their labor in so many ways. And yeah, I don't know, obviously, if all of the good things had already been done, we wouldn't have any problems. I don't know. It's a weird premise.
Representative Barkas, do you care? That was your comment you made.
Yes,
So.
Thank you, Brandy. It hasn't been done because there's other things that have been done. There's policies that have been implemented for years and years and years around housing, around landlord-tenant law. All these different things have been in place to get at the crux of the issue, and they've found better ways of getting at this. The problem is that we've kind of gone the other way over the last several years with over-regulation, over-burdensome policies, getting at the lack of supply of housing. Congressman Heck, in the new Democrat report that just came out a year ago, stated this exact fact. The two of us opened up a housing policy forum, and we talked about that very issue. We are years and years behind, 10 plus years behind on building our housing supply, and we can't keep up with it. Washington State is growing at the fastest rate it's ever grown in our state's history. We're going to be at 8+ million people here real quickly. And that burden on existing supply and new supply is not keeping pace. So I'll also tell you this about profit. I just went to an event. I served on the Boys and Girls Club board for years in Thurston County. And last Friday night, I went to an event. It was called the Born to Be Wild auction. And at that auction, all those people, those profit-seeking people, those developers, those business people, all those people, a room of 600 people raised $600,000 out of their own pockets to give to the community to help the Boys and Girls Club. And that happens everywhere, all around. Foundations, charitable trusts, all these different things. You know where that money comes from? Landlords. It comes from businesses. It comes from people like myself who give back to our communities with the profits that we make.
Right on time. I'm going to have the student debate on each side answer my last question, and we're going to move on to closing statements. Having listened to some of the answers given, Summer, do you think there's one argument in particular from the other side that you believe is fundamentally dishonest?
What do you mean by dishonest?
It's being spun a way that you don't see as being accurate, or is just a lie?
I'm not going to accuse them of lying, but I do disagree with many of their arguments.
Can you say, sitting here, one of the things that you've heard from the opposition that you believe strongly in being dishonest?
Yeah, sure. I think it's, I would hesitate to use the word dishonest. I don't want to
Not in good faith. Not presented in good faith.
I disagree with the idea that the rights claims here that are being disputed here are even, right? That the rights claim between a landlord's right to raise rent by 10% is the same thing as a tenant's right to be able to exist and have shelter, right? I think Dina covered that very clearly. I don't think that's an acceptable argument.
And I'm going to ask the same question to you, since I won't call people dishonest. Something that you believe is an argument that just is not presented in good faith.
So sorry, y'all. I don't believe that the characterization of who landlords are is in any way like the majority of who landowners are, as Representative Vargas has countlessly and repeatedly stated. We have a lot of landowners in this room, and I don't see them, wearing black capes and being, portrayed as being these horrible individuals. I know a lot of these individuals myself, and they're very kind individuals. So that is a gross mischaracterization.
Okay, we're going to proceed to our final round. Each debater is going to be given a 3-minute closing statement. We are going to start with the side opposed to rent control. Your first closing statement, please.
Got our orders down. Well, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight, and I hope that I've been able to present some facts. I hope that I've been able to present an argument. I totally respect the opportunity to talk about this. And I think at the crux of it, we have to have more of this. We have to have more civil discourse when it comes to these different things. Policy is important. Policy is established when we get together and we look at what the problem statement is, and we try to find out what needs to be done. But when we mischaracterize people, when we put a label on them because I'm a certain party or I'm a certain this, we don't get work done. And I've proven that in my legislative role. I reached across the aisle, and I was the one that actually helped get the source of income bill passed, which helped tenants. I reached across the aisle this last year, and we tried to put forth 4 different pieces of legislation around eviction reform. And unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. It didn't work out because sometimes other side and one side is not willing to do the extra work to come together and actually think about what might be best for both parties, landlords and tenants. So I just want to leave you with this aspect that says we can't continue to pile on the burden, the regulatory burden, upon the landowners. We're going to lose supply. I know I heard from the other side that says, no, it's not accurate, we're not doing this. I can tell you firsthand, I've been in the business for 30 years. I'm losing owners left and right. I'm having more and more people sell their properties. After this last round of laws passed, we lost 10, 15 properties. It may not seem like a lot, but those are properties that all went for sale because guess what? The housing market's booming right now, and you can sell just like that. So people are calling me and saying, why should I be a landlord anymore when I can just sell? And it's a good thing because that's another house sold and a family gets to move into that, but it's another property off the market in the rental pool. And we're losing more and more of those things. And if we don't start looking at the other solutions, if we don't start looking at how to drive that cost down, how to build more things, how to help all, how to create equity in everything that we do in the policy world that we're in, we're going to be right back in this position again. Rent control is not the answer. Rent stabilization is not the answer. Telling people what they can and cannot charge, how they have to manage their properties, how they have to manage their finances does not work. If it worked so well, it would be everywhere. It would be the policy. We wouldn't be having this debate. We'd all be going, hey, that's a great idea. Let's do it. Thank you.
And for the side in favor of rent control, a closing argument.
If 10 or 15 landlords deciding that they're going to sell their house is your greatest concern, if you think that's the biggest stake in this debate, then I suppose there's not much I can tell you right now that's going to change your mind. Right, but I think these 10 or 15 houses are greatly outweighed by the massive housing crisis that includes thousands of people not being able to stay in the homes that in the area that they want to be living in. I'm really not in the business of stereotyping landlords and making them into Disney villains, maybe, is what I've been accused of. But we have to look at just the role that they are playing here, right? I'm not saying that they're like fundamentally bad people or anything. All that I'm saying is that it would be acceptable to limit them to a 1% to 2% rent increase each year, right? This is in no way infringing on their right to housing. Those 10 to 15 lost houses have absolutely nothing to do with rent stabilization, right? Rent stabilization is like only going to decrease the amount that they can radically raise people's rents for no reason except their own profit making. I also want to address these like multiple other alternatives that we've gotten out of their side, right? Like the idea of these prefabricated houses that we can just move people into. Of course, this is fine. I don't have any other problem with other housing alternatives, right? We think that these things have to go together. I told you that this is a multifaceted issue. I'm not going to pretend that rent stabilization is going to make the world a utopia. What I am going to say, though, is that prefabricated houses are not going to do very much for Hilltop, for example, for downtown Tacoma. Like, where are you going to put those houses, right? That's the problem I was talking about. If we rely on this kind of strategy, you end up, like, the only open spaces where these houses could go is probably, like, over in Puyallup. But that means so many people having to be, moved away from their homes, right? Moved away from public transportation, right? We cannot accept only solutions that force people to move out of where they live. It is okay to have other solutions to the issues that we're talking about. Homelessness is a very complex issue, but we have to understand that as long as landlords can raise rent by as much as however much they want on a year-to-year basis, there's the possibility that they can exploit people, right? If your landlord is making you pay hundreds of dollars more than you did the last year, that's not stable. That's not a way that people can live, right? That forces people out of their homes. It forces them from being able to live a stable life where they know that they can make next month's rent, where they know that they can pay for their groceries the next month.
Hannah? Your closing remarks against rent control.
You might be like me and perhaps don't own land and thus wonder why this debate should even matter to you, why land ownership matters to you. The answer to this is that we all have a stake in this debate. We all own a form of property, be it a cell phone, a car, that books, the odd houseplant, or even the clothes on your back. In this way, we are all unified under one principle, that we are given 3 unalienable rights: the right to life, liberty, and the ability to own property. At the end of this debate, you might not identify the landowner, but each of us share a commonality in having these 3 rights, and because of this, we are morally obligated to protect and preserve an individual's right to property ownership. This must be prioritized above all else. The ownership of property is deeply rooted in the basis of our American dream through empowering the average person to have a stock in society. For this reason, it is important to remember why we would adopt a rent control policy in the first place: to provide housing in order to be more equitable to a greater amount of people. Rent control does not provide equity in the way that we wish. Instead, rent control restricts people, restricts landowners, restricts you and me, rather than providing us with the freedoms that we prize. Therefore, even if you don't own land, the outcome of this debate will still affect you, because rent control enables the government to have an increased authority over something that they don't even own, that the government has no personal connection to, and that they don't even work for. And the government will use this for their gain. In short, we voluntarily disavow our right to have a say in what the government, say what happens to our property, and surrender it to the government. We facilitate the betterment of the government rather than protecting our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Landowners tirelessly labor over and stake a part of their ability to survive in their property, put their blood, sweat, and tears in providing housing for others. Not only does rent control restrict landowners to continue to use their land to provide for their families and for others, but it restricts the opportunities for other individuals to also become homeowners themselves, while forcing those who own homes to eventually become tenants themselves. This is harmful because the more time we devote to tending our property through the use of our autonomy, the more it becomes a delicately cultivated reflection of our lives. In this manner, our right to own property is not merely a way to achieve our hopes and ambitions, but is what builds our individuality. To severely limit one's say in their property is to promote an erasure of one's unique character. Adopting a rent control policy would be detrimental in the preservation of our rights and for Tacoma as a whole. Tonight, regardless of if you are a landowner or a tenant, I implore you to choose the principle that embodies the American dream, the plan that benefits both landowners and tenants, and to allow for the people to be able to decide what to do with the property that they stake their means on. We all have a right to have a say in what happens to our property. And for the sake of our life and for our liberty, the right to property ownership must be protected for all.
Dino Braccio, you have the final closing argument.
Right. I guess, wow. So I think it's telling that one of the worst things that can be thought of is to be forced to become a renter themselves. I think that shows the status that renters have in society, the value that we as a society place on renters. And I think that's, what we're trying to change here. We're trying to say that, as a renter, that your stability is important, that your well-being matters. We could talk about personal versus private property, but I don't really need to get in, multiple homes to rent out for profit is not the same as my shirt. Those are just different categories. I would also like to talk into this extreme legislation that passed this past year that is forcing landlords out of the market. What I'm almost certain is being referred to here is that now when a tenant falls behind in rent, they have 14 days to catch up before the eviction proceedings starts instead of 3. That's the kind of extreme legislation that is too far for landlords. And so I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry that is pushing a handful of landlords out of the business, because it's a business, right? But it's tenants' lives. It's tenants' home. It's ability to be stable. And land ownership is really weird when you think about the fact that this is all almost any of us in this room are owning land on this country because of genocide, and that is the only way that any of this is feasible. So if you want to talk about erasure of one's unique character, I think that's pretty relevant. Yeah, I would just, got a lot of thoughts, but really we're just trying to limit how much profit. Those donations at charities, those come from the work of workers or from the rent of renters. Didn't come, no one bootstraps because it's a made up thing that doesn't exist. It comes from exploiting other people. It's the only way you can have this much money, and it would be cool if we did less of it.
Okay, a round of applause for all of our debaters. Round of applause for all of our debaters. So as you did at the beginning, again, we're using a Woodward shift of opinion ballot. So you are going to be messaging the same number that you did earlier. I believe we're going to have this up on the screen. The number that you're going to message is 37607. And then for the content of the message, you'll vote in the following ways. If you believe that there should be rent control in Tacoma, please enter 704651. 704651. If you are against rent control in Tacoma, please enter 704655. 704655. If you're still unsure, I suppose you can still message him. 704-656, 704-656. We'll give you a couple minutes, and we'll have the results shortly. And they'll bring it up.
Through 2 slides, a shift of 2 PowerPoint slides. I mean, they might know it better than I do. Yeah. Do you all know how to star swipe? Yeah.
Yeah, it's
idea.
It was good.
What's happening?
Moments that people laughed. Twitter feed. How are the comments? How are the comments?
Oh, you don't want to tell him? Oh.
Were they saying good things about me? I'm Karl Marx. Did they use any Donald Trump references? Okay, thank God. Huh? You never get to the story behind me, you know. I mean, people don't know that I came from grandchildren. Blah, 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 blah. They never, they didn't take the time to ever look into that. Self-made. I came from nothing. When I first got married, I was truck repossessed. I almost lost my place to live. And, I love that fact that literally, I mean, I would love to show you the amount of money that I give to charity every year. If I can. Oh, it is fine.
All right. We're going to have a result momentarily, but I love a little audience participation. Who are students here? Students? Oh, wow. That's great. And who just came because they're involved in this topic in some way? Oh, great.
Oh, that's cool.
Wow, that's awesome.
It's a good crowd.
I ask you guys questions now.
I'll do it back to you.
Yes. The snapping is, I like the
is that what you're
snapping. It's
doing?
very respectful.
Thank you.
So for those who came, who are involved in this some way, you have landlords? If you, does nobody want to raise if they're landlords? Oh, okay. Renters? Who's renters? Pretty equal. Pretty equal. Eviction response. Okay. So the new law that passed is something that you were very interested in. Cool. I sensed something there. I didn't know if you were overly thrilled with it or... We're going to have this result momentarily. But again, I think it's awesome that you guys care to come out on a Tuesday night and hear about this. Over how many years? Just this year. See, now we're going to have a crowd debate.
Uh-oh, crowd debate.
Crowd
It's
debate.
going to get out of control. I want to get off the stage.
So patient. If it makes you feel better, I already know who won. I'm a good secret keeper.
Did you get the envelope from Ernst and Winnie? Bank accounting firm? It's not us. I think it's really close. I think actually, it's probably closer than you think. There are really a lot more members and a lot of people here.
All right, I have results for everyone.
And I don't think
I heard drum rolls are popular in this. No? Okay. Again, we're using a Woodward shift of opinion poll. So for those in favor of rent control, prior to tonight's debate, 43% were in favor. That changed to 48%, a 5% change. For those against rent control, 29% were against prior to the start of tonight's debate, with 44% being against, a 15% change. The undecideds went from 27% to 7%, meaning the largest shift of opinion was against rent control at 15%. So again, thank you to everyone for coming out. I want to read quickly again the thank yous for folks who make tonight possible, including Pacific Lutheran University School of Arts and Communication, the TOH Carl Forensics Forum, the Ruth Anderson Public Debate Organizing Committee, the Associated Students of PLU, as well as Ruth Anderson and Catherine Hedrick for making this event possible. Thank you for everyone for coming out.